Welcome to the Antidote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth Cushell.
Well, another week, another layer, I guess, of this. I guess very limited layers we're going to talk about later on in this program, but another layer nonetheless of this larger Donald Trump campaign collusion narrative, which we reiterate goes far just beyond Russia and this notion of democracy and a Cold War and whatnot. But another layer seems to have been opened up in the name of one Howard Lorber, and we're going to talk about Howard Lorber here for a few minutes because in the process of just doing some digging up, learning some information on him. We went down a little bit of a rabbit hole with some pretty, I think, important information. So I'm going to, Jeremy, allow you to first explain what has come out about Lorber within the mainstream narrative of what is coming out about him in terms of the mainstream narrative into the investigation of all things related to Trump in the 2016 election, and then we can get into some of the things that we've discovered on, I think, a far deeper level than even the election related to Mr. Lorber. So Jeremy, I'll let you start out with just to kind of give a little bit of a synopsis of what's coming out about Lorber within the mainstream narrative right now, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, I guess this just a few days ago, I guess earlier in the week, it was an ABC News breaking story. And a lot has been made of this by all kinds of circles here, including Donald Trump himself, saying that it basically clears his name of having a phone call with his son Don Jr. in relationship to this infamous Trump Tower meeting, the meeting that sort of sparked all of the Russia Gate scandal in a big way in the mainstream media, having to do with actual Russians in the meeting with people like Manafort and Don Jr. in early June. But the title of the story is called Blocked Calls with Donald Trump Jr. Long a mystery, went to longtime family friends, sources. Both men have close ties to President Trump and actively supported his campaign, by John Santucci and Matthew Mosk, posted in the evening of January 31st, 2019. Investigated, I'm going to read from it just a little bit. Investigators on the Senate Intelligence Committee have learned the identities of 3 blocked phone calls with Donald Trump Jr. just before and after the now infamous Trump Tower meeting on June 9th, 2016. 3 sources familiar with the calls told ABC News. The calls to block numbers, which came on June 6th and after the meeting on June 9th, were between Trump Jr.'s cell phone and 2 family friends, NASCAR CEO Brian France and real estate developer Howard Lorber, according to the sources. Both men have close ties to President Donald Trump and actively supported his campaign during the 2016 election. Trump gloated about the news in a late-night tweet on Thursday, saying the call were, quote, conclusively found not to be made by me, unquote. This is Donald Trump's tweet. He says, just out, the big deal, very mysterious Don Jr. telephone calls after the innocent Trump Tower meeting that the media and Dems said were made to his father, me, were just conclusively found not to be made to me. They were made to friends and business associates of Don. Really sad.
And of course, Trump is citing this as proof of his innocence. But as we're about to get into here, I think that this Lorber making this call is, in many ways, could be just as significant as Trump himself making the call. So we'll get into here.
Yes, and I'll skip down a little bit and just read a couple more paragraphs where even into the mainstream media, tiny little inklings about what this actually suggests in relationship to Russia. But we might actually suggest that this actually once again reminds us how close the actual material network's ties surrounding the 11/9 Trump operation and the 9/11 2001 operation in Lower Manhattan in relationship to big real estate targets and all of that. But so back to the article. Quote, Trump's ties with Lorber run even deeper and have attracted the interest of congressional investigators, sources said. In the 1990s, when Trump started exploring real estate options in Russia, Lorber accompanied him on a tour of Moscow. A real estate developer who has done business there, Lorber appeared in a biographical video of Trump that aired on Jumbotrons at the 2016 Republican National Convention before his acceptance speech. A spokesperson for Lorber said the real estate executive, quote, does not recall having conversations with Donald Jr. in the summer of 2016, but in any event, he has absolutely not had conversations with Donald Jr. about any Russian matters, unquote. And then it talks about how a message for the spokesperson at NASCAR was not immediately returned. And so just one quick thing that before, I want to make sure that we just touch on this Howard Lorber. A lot has been made in a lot of the investigation, the more honest investigation about the background of Trump in relationship to the aspects of the mafia, the Eurasian organized crime syndicate, Israeli passport holding gangsters that interface with global real estate deals and apparent money laundering operations via real estate. As one of the least regulated businesses in terms of large transactions involving even sort of piles and piles of cash. And in the midst of that, a lot has been made of the Trump Soho, the Bayrock Group, and Felix Sater, and then how a lot of these guys are connected to I believe it's called the Port Washington Chabad Center, where Sater was recognized as a Man of the Year. And, even some of the mainstream media, including Politico, talked about the happy-go-lucky Jewish group that connects Trump and Putin and dealing with Chabad. But I have not yet heard the name of I believe it's called the Southampton, the Chabad of Southampton Center. And so we'll link to this, but if you look up their 17th annual dinner, the Chabad of Southampton Jewish Center, you see that the honorary dinner chairs the first is Howard M. Lorber. So, and then down in there's also members of the Safra family, which is tendential to this at this point, but we will again touch into that whole history, Safra, and the relationship to aspects of Russian organized criminal money laundering through the heart of not only the aspects of the New York private banking system, global banking system that Safra was involved in, Republic Bank, but also even into the heart of the New York Federal Reserve, which, as we pointed out before, that people like Maurice Hank Greenberg, who keep popping up both in terms of September 11th, his son heading up subsidiaries of the AIG that were closely, targeted and associated with the actual physical attacks on the World Trade Center, but then also continuing on into this question about what's it called again, Greg? The Committee for the National Interest, is that the name of it?
Center for the National Interest.
Yes, which looks as though it were the platform, the institutional platform that was the creation of Donald Trump's, not only his Russia policy, but other aspects of his global foreign policy, and the epicenter of the infamous Mayflower speech, where this aspect began being rolled out in a very public fashion, and we've talked about the Center for the National Interest. Did I get that right? Center for the National Interest, Greg? I'm sorry.
Yes, you did. You got it right.
Okay. And we've looked into that, and Kissinger is highly involved. Maurice Hank Greenberg is highly involved. Dov Zakheim is involved. And then also the leadership of it, Dmitry Simes, who it looks like has now fled the country and gone back and entered into recognized Russian intelligence roles in the high level in the Russian state-sanctioned media. Dmitry Simes has deep connections with even such so-called dissidents as Rand Paul. So there's that whole background there.
Dmitry Simes is, last I heard, was playing the role of a pro-Trump mouthpiece in debates on Russian state television. So
So I think it was just wanted to mention that once again the Chabad connection is here. We see it keep popping up in all of these networks. It even popped up in the network with one Ezra Cohen Watnick that appears like Michael Flynn to be in the orbit of even sort of certain apparent counterintelligence psyops, campaigns such as things surrounding like QAnon and aspects of that. And we've dealt with that in previous shows and shown that network behind Michael Flynn having to do with this very interesting and dark intersection between people like Michael Ledeen, Barbara Ledeen, his wife, still involved at the highest levels of Senate hearings, including in stuff like the Brett Kavanaugh debacle, and she's the one supposedly who connected people like Ledeen and Flynn and Ezra Cohen Watnick. But even Ezra Cohen Watnick has a background in supporting Chabad projects while he was in college. We've covered that in previous shows, and people can find that just by Googling Ezra Cohen, as he was known, I guess, at that point. And
Chabad is the University of Pennsylvania, where I believe Trump and Ronald Lauder both graduated from the business school there. So I don't know if that's connected or not. It's just an interesting irony.
yeah, and so I would just also just finally point out that you don't see like the sort of that these guys, these sort of high level real estate guys or other parts of these networks, they tend to just trace back to Chabad rather than things like more or like American, I would call more American based Jewish religious organizations, such as in the realm of the Reform movement, which is very American. And I would say it represents some of the more blatant and becoming obvious split in certain ways in terms of certain aspects of the politics of I would say the majority of the American Jewish community in certain ways, with this whole thing of like that Trump is somehow an enemy of the Jews, but is so tightly connected to these sort of Chabadnik. There's an element of this Judeo-supremacism and the extremism represented by the regime in Israel, and then how it's very much tied into certain aspects of Russia, as we know now. The head rabbi, as installed by Vladimir Putin, is a Chabadnik, Beryl Lazar, and a lot of these networks do connect this globally. And I have before called Chabad basically the religious military intelligence arm of organized global Jewish power at this point.
It's interesting with regards to Chabad and this whole angle that we're coming at here is that as revealing as that Politico article from April of 2017 was, the happy-go-lucky Jewish group that connects Trump and Putin, the connections appear to even go far deeper than even what was laid out in that article.
Yes, and so that I would ask people to go look into this next, other branch here of New York centric Chabad, of the Southampton Jewish Chabad of Southampton Jewish Center, and see who all is in there, and whether that further describes some of these very specific Trump networks, because it looks like to me like it does. So back to Lorber specifically, and why does any of this matter? So I'm just going to read through a few tweets that Craig Unger put out that relate to his investigations in House of Trump, House of Putin, which are really, which is one of the most well investigated books at this point in terms of this connection to Russia and organized crime behind the Trump, deep Trump background here. So number one, Craig Unger says, fascinating that the blocked number phone call circa 2016 Trump Tower meeting went to real estate developer Howard Lorber, who is much more than just a family friend. In 96, when Trump went to Russia to try to develop Trump Tower in Moscow, Lorber came with his partner, Bennett LeBeau. Number two, as per House of Trump, LeBeau had begun investing in Moscow in early 90s when one inevitably dealt with dubious characters, among them Vadim Rabinovich, who had just taken part in the Tel Aviv meeting giving Semyon Mogilevich control of lucrative Ukraine energy trade. And then three, in effort to develop Trump Tower Moscow, they were shown around by Moscow Mayor Yuri Luzkov, who was also close to Mogilevich and Vyacheslav Ivankov, a murderous mobsters who happened to be a Trump Tower resident on Fifth Avenue and a regular at Trump's Taj Mahal. And I just want to point out there that we've before mentioned Ivankov as this key figure, this key lieutenant. I believe we actually referenced him even when we were talking about Avigdor Lieberman's background in Moldova, as thinking about how his background as working as a bouncer, a club bouncer in a mob town, a Mogilevich mob town to some extent, or maybe even other elements of Eurasian organized crime. That being a doorman, a bouncer at that level is really at some level being some kind of intelligence operative in terms of keeping track and deciding access in relationship to who's coming and going to these key clubs.
Well, when you think about, and I'm not definitively making accusations here without proof, this is just us kind of talking here. That when you think about one of the things that Craig Unger's laid out in his book, that I mean in numerous interviews, he lays it out pretty much every interview he does that I've heard that the Russian mafia, the mafia is an extension of the Russian state, and so things like this would lend credence to the claims of assertions of people like Richard Silverstein that indeed Avigdor Lieberman is a long-term Russian KGB asset, if not agent.
Yeah, and all of the activity at this time when some of these individuals were being sent to the United States, and Avigdor Lieberman then goes to Israel, and I believe it was a different character who was from Moldova at the same time as it looks like that Avigdor Lieberman was. I think it was Gula, I can't exactly remember, but people can go back to our show on that a few back, but this represents that there was major moves being made right around that time, right before where it becomes obvious that Trump is entering into this very Soviet sphere of influence, both in terms of aspects of Eurasian organized crime and the escalation of this kind of money being dumped into his properties, and apparently he's just overseeing it somehow, whether he's knowledgeable of it or not, and also he's being recruited at some level by the highest levels of aspects of the then Soviet intelligence bureaucracy. So, and Ivankov, we've mentioned, is when you go look at the book Red Mafia by Robert Friedman, the only reference to Trump in that entire book is about how the FBI, I believe, was looking for Ivankov throughout New York and in Brooklyn and the areas of Brighton Beach, Moscow on the Hudson, and then also, or Moscow on the Atlantic, or the New Odessa in relationship to Ukraine and Ukrainian organized crime, and just go look at the background of Michael Cohen and his brother and who they married and those relationships, how those are tied into deep into aspects of the energy trade in relationship to Ukraine. And we know a lot of that background about Manafort in relationship to people like Dmitry Firtash, and how a lot of this meeting in Tel Aviv in 1995, a lot of it appears to be involving delivering the krisha, we might call it, the roof of the Ukrainian energy trade under the Mogilevich network, which then can be easily seen as some aspect of the larger krisha of the government in Moscow. Okay, so there's that whole background there, and Ivankov just pops up in relationship to this one mention of Trump in Red Mafia, where the FBI is on the look for him, and then they finally find him in Trump Tower. And but he's also very deeply involved on the scene quite a lot in relationship to Trump's Taj Mahal and all of that. And so then last two tweets from Craig Unger. that I'll read out. Number 4, Mayor Luskov had other ties to Mogilevich through real estate company Sistema. Not much came of this 1996 trip, though Trump boasted that it was going to be huge. 5, fast forward to 2013. By this time, Trump has pinned hopes for Moscow development on billionaire real estate mogul Aras Agalarov, who also has ties to Mogilevich. In February 2013, his son Emin had performed at a big Russian mafia birthday party Mogi gave for Russian mob boss Sergei Mikhailov. And then 6. So in June 2016, Emin sets up infamous Trump Tower meeting with Don Jr., Jared Manafort, and the Russians, in which Russians, many with ties to Russian mafia, clearly want Team Trump to promise that sanctions will be lifted. Lorber is the new figure in this. What is his real role?
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that background. Thank you for that background, Jeremy. And so, I guess where we'd like to take this from here is we did a series of shows back right around the anniversary of September 11th, titled "From 9/11 to 11/9." And in this series, among the things that we covered in our series was what you uncovered with this. How would you describe this connection of real estate and 9/11 9/11 operation, particularly as it relates to payments made to one Bernard Carrick, who was instrumental in the what happened in Lower Manhattan on September 11th, and even involving a trip to Israel for counterterrorism made a couple weeks before September 11th. How would you like to tie that into this conversation?
Yeah, so when I saw this name Howard Lorber come up, I remembered we'd mentioned it before, and I couldn't remember exactly in what context. But then we began to figure it out. It was from this, specifically from the end of this show titled "From 9/11 to 11/9 Part 4." That we did, and I believe we recorded on Constitution Day, and we dealt with, like, we actually put at the very center of the 9/11 operation, as even identified by certain leaked documents from the FBI, able-dangered, classified, top-secret reports on 9/11, that the figures that were fingered and identified as being at some of the heart of this Israeli intelligence angle to September 11th, and apparently this Lower Manhattan aspect in terms of the World Trade Center and human beings being, blown up, basically vaporized, many of them on live television, and tons of concrete and steel being blown into smithereens, basically micronized, dustified at some level on live television. That this in this actual chart that represents the investigation of who the FBI believed was really responsible for 9/11, we begin to put people like who have deep connections to things like the Talpiot program in Israel, and this question of this long-term Israeli military intelligence high-tech strategy of dominating the high technology at the epicenter of this. And people can go look at that show. We did some of the links there. This chart we referred to was from an article called "Debunking the 28 Pages, Top Secret 9/11 Document Revealed" by Jeff Smith at Veterans Today on July 19th, 2016. And it was a response really to when they were putting out the 28 pages, and it was filling out a lot of the background there. And in this chart, on the top side is sort of what you might call the cover operation. And when we did, people might really want to go back and re-look at our 9/11 to 11/9 shows, but specifically this one, where we where we talk about the coming together of these different aspects of the September 11th operation. That at some level you have a military operation, and that involves things like a combination of software backdoors and inserts on large aspects and swaths of the U.S. government computers, including the FAA, but the Pentagon and people like Christopher Bolin in the architecture of terror Lorber. Look that up. He's looked at a lot of this and talked about how P-Tech as a software company looks like it actually acted as a cutout with a sort of an Arab front on it, but facilitated by a back end of high level B'nai B'rith folks and high level, including like maybe 33rd degrees Judeo-Masonic Freemasons of B'nai B'rith, tied into aspects of organizations such as Guardium, which is an apparent Israeli military intelligence sort of corporate financing cutout of some sort, technology front of some sort. That P-Tech was, this kind of software was then loaded onto large swaths of U.S. government computers in the run-up to September 11th, and people like Amit Yaron are characters who look to be at the epicenter of some of this cyber military side of the 9/11 operation. But there's also the military operation of actually the death and destruction that we perceive on September 11th. Which has to do with, large amounts of some type of explosive devices of some sort being used on September 11th to destroy humans and buildings. So that's a military part of the operation. But there's also this intelligence side of the operation where it has to do with the entirety of the thing of the planes and the hijackers and these Arab Muslim young men, and basically what you would call the legend in an intelligence fashion, where it's the script, the sort of script made for television for the people to digest ultimately. And then, so that's what the top half of this diagram out of the FBI Able Dangerous classified files on 9/11 covers such networks as Turki bin Faisal al-Assad, Bandar Bush and his wife, Omar Bayoumi, Nawaf al-Khazmi, the Riggs Bank, Khalid al-Midar, the Safari Club. But then on the bottom half of it, it then deals with the Israeli connections and Israeli Mossad, including people like Paul Kurzberg, and then the so-called dancing Israelis that were actually just one of multiple Israeli intelligence teams that were identified, and some of them were actually caught and arrested on September 11th. Some of them, as we pointed out before, that this putting the front and center of the celebrating Israelis, where it's basically they're caught just, it still like seems like a horrible thing. They're celebrating while people are, dying, and they're filming, but it doesn't put them in the heart of the actual doing it operation. Maybe they knew, maybe they're happy about it, as Netanyahu says, 9/11 was very good for Israel. It'll generate immediate sympathy in the wake of September 11th, but that doesn't put them actually in the heart of it. But meanwhile, there were all these other Israeli intelligence teams that were caught, including apparently teams that were running towards the bridges and tunnels of Lower Manhattan in these same white vans, apparently organized by Mossad front groups such as Urban Moving Systems, and headed towards things like the George Washington Bridge, which not only is like a main thoroughfare in the northern part of Manhattan, in and out, but also apparently is also at the epicenter of things like the IT hardscape, the infrastructure, the cabling of things like that connect the United States to the global financial system, SWIFT banking, and all of that. So when you combine that, these teams being apparently arrested with explosive, with intent to take the George Washington Bridge down, and things like the Lincoln and Holland tunnels, basically create an even more terror to isolate New York, both digitally and physically in many ways. And then the question of what was also going on and what's, surrounding what's called Flight 93 in relationship to additional targets in the U.S. Capitol, and whether 9/11 was supposed to be even worse in many ways than what it was, which is as bad as we can consider in terms of the way that, the deaths of almost 3,000 people has been turned and catapulted into the death and destruction of millions of people's lives, and I would say the negative impact on billions of people's lives. But back to this chart and what we were describing in all of this is that on this bottom half, it talks about how the Jewish Agency Board of Governors, which traces back to someone like Natan Sharansky, who we've mentioned before, who is in the epicenter of the Red Mafia book at the end of it when it's describing the Red Mafia's influence and involvement in Israel in specific ways. And Sharansky was being warned of taking money from certain key mob figures, Eurasian mafia figures, and using it in relationship to his project to help settle Soviet Jews into Israel. So that's the Jewish Agency Board of Governors, and basically on the very bottom half of there it said Eitan Wertheimer, who was the Talpiot connection. His family runs some high tech production companies, or did. We talked about that in that show. But then it connects to it says $250,000. Then it connects to Steve Witkoff, who then connects to Bernard Kerik and Bernard Kerik's wife, and then from the other side you see something about the Gambino crime syndicate. And so we covered a lot of that background there in terms of Bernard Kerik going to Israel in the weeks before September 11th, in terms of sort of apparent counter-terrorism in meetings. You pointed out, Greg, I believe, that seems there's a very interesting resonance with one Rudy Giuliani being in Israel in the weeks, I think, or surrounding the 11/9, the 11/9 election in 2016.
Yes, I believe matters related to things like cybersecurity, and on behalf of the law firm he was working with.
So there's that, and so then in the process of investigating Steve Witkoff and what that was, and this has been covered in aspects of the mainstream press in terms of what they were calling loans to Bernard Kerik from these two people, Eitan Wertheimer, who was involved with the Jewish Agency Board of Governors, along with people like Natan Sharansky, who, by the way, I forgot to mention, was also the go-to guy for George W. Bush in terms of making the case, or his alleged justification for the aggressive warfare in Iraq, and this idea of remaking the Middle East in regards to nation building, democracy projects, and all of that. And so that it was Natan Sharansky's book about that Bush referred to when he was making that case. But Sharansky's also the godfather of the whole idea of the new anti-Semitism, where there's this intense linking of criticism of Israel to basically is just blatant anti-Semitism at some level. Of course, that's being used intensely right now in relationship to anti-boycott, divestment, sanction, BDS laws in the Senate, and even people like Barry Weiss, the New York Times writer, who talked about the intellectual dark web, right, sort of surrounding people like Sam Harris and Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson, and she sort of does a nod or a shake to Abby Martin being on Joe Rogan's podcast because of her history as a 9/11 truther and all of that. But Barry Weiss was recently on Joe Rogan's podcast and made this blatantly false statement that no one's trying to link anti-Semitism to criticism of Israel. Meanwhile, like the idea of anti-BDS is going through there. There's this whole Natan Sharansky background to the whole idea of the new anti-Semitism, and you're allowed to criticize Israel in a very partial, controlled way. So there's all of that is in the background of all of this. But this idea of Steve Witkoff, we then began to get into who is Steve Witkoff, and we began running into some of these articles that were surrounding the Trump election and the administration and his financing and his best buds. Because in the midst of this story about Howard Lorber, it's basically saying that Howard Lorber is a close Trump friend. Sometimes he's called his best friend, and Trump seems to throw that around a lot. Like Roy Cohn at some point was his very best friend until he pushed him under the bus, apparently, when he was dying of AIDS, right?
Yeah. You're right, or died of cancer, as Alex Jones would say.
Right. So, but it is very clear that this crew is very close to Donald Trump, and so I just want to get into a few pieces that sort of show how close people like Steve Witkoff is to both Howard Lorber and how both of them, how close they are to Donald Trump. Okay, so it's interesting. There's an article about what's going to happen with Michael Cohen's Tribeca condo. It's $18,500 a month. Tribeca condo goes into contract, and this is from 6 Square Feet on Thursday, November 29th, 2018, by Dana Schultz. It talks about how after dropping its price from $25,000 to $18,500 a month on November 12th, Michael Cohen's ill-fated Tribeca condo went into contract on Tuesday. 6 Square Feet uncovered. Talks about his legal issues and the previous dealings with Russia, and how he's basically, he's losing all of his money and fighting his legal battles. And then it says, quote, Cohen's condo purchase was surprising at the time, considering he had just gotten done cutting his $9 million Trump Park Avenue apartment on the market, putting his $9 million Trump Park Avenue apartment on the market as collateral against a bank loan. As we previously reported, the building was developed by the Fisher brothers, Witkoff, and New Valley, the latter two of whom are headed up by longtime Trump confidants Steve Witkoff and Howard Lorber. The two developers gave Cohen a $3.5 million short-term mortgage instead of a traditional bank loan after federal investigators have supposedly all but bankrupted him. Okay, so there's that connection, right, directly to Michael Cohen. But then let's just go back, and I just want to finish this up and then pass it back over to you, Greg. There's this interesting Newsweek article from 2000 and when is this from? 2017, I think. Yeah, from the end of 2017. Donald Trump's New York real estate friends love his tax bill. It will make them even richer. And I believe we were referencing some of this in our show on 9/11 to 11/9 Part 4. We were talking about Steve Witkoff and his connection to Donald Trump. Okay, but this is an article from December 17th, 2017 by Graham Lanktree. It says, it is no surprise that many of President Donald Trump's closest friends in the world of New York real estate are in love with the tax bill that Congress are trying to pass before the Christmas break. It could make them all even richer than they are already. The bill promises to lower corporate tax by 14%, as well as slashing personal taxes for real estate moguls. The tax breaks will add more than $1 trillion to U.S. national debt, according to government and independent analysis, and will be paid for in part with $400 billion in cuts to Medicare and other entitlement programs over the next decade. Okay, an aside here, I think it's becoming clear to a lot of people that what we've been talking about, that there's a sort of Trump pump and dump operation that really represents what he's really doing in relationship to things like the economy, that these tax cuts where there was little blips of like a little bit of activity, most people are beginning to recognize that it's the same as aspects of trickle-down economics, or that the very few of these wealthiest of the corporations have really deeply reinvested their resources in the depths of the American economy, and basically it's very similar to every time this has been done before, where the rich are getting richer once again, and there's not really core investment in renewing American industry or new forms of economic activity. So that's just an aside. But I think that it's related to this whole network, that basically when Trump puts together his economic team, large portions of it is basically just, real estate speculator, vulture, billionaire types, as we pointed out before. Okay, so back to this article. Quote, but New York real estate mogul Steve Witkoff, who counts President Trump as a personal friend, says the bill will grow businesses like his, and that money will trickle down and turn the U.S. economy into a powerhouse, increasing average Americans' wages and paying down the debt. Okay, so this is more from Witkoff, but then it talks about where they knew each other. Witkoff became friends with Trump in the 1990s when he was building up his billion-dollar real estate empire and Trump was buying up properties in Manhattan. 2 decades on, Witkoff owns 51 properties, including buildings all around the world. Okay, then down here, it begins to actually talk about it brings Lorber into it, okay? So, all right, here we go. I'm back to this article. Quote, Witkoff is proud to identify himself as a member of the 1%, the wealthiest Americans, who he says share his support for Trump's tax bill. He is also good friends with billionaire real estate tycoon Howard Lorber, one of Trump's closest friends, who he says shares a similar view of Trump's tax bill. A spokesperson for Lorber declined to comment when contacted by Newsweek. Here we go. Here's a key paragraph here. Witkoff and Lorber were among a cadre of New York real estate developers who attended a lunch with Trump at Trump Tower on June 8th, 2016, during the 2016 election. After the lunch, which came just a day before Donald Trump Jr.'s infamous meeting there with a Russian lawyer now being probed by Robert Mueller, many of the attendees donated heavily to Trump's campaign. At the time, it looked certain Trump would become the Republican Party's nominee for the presidential race, and he began raising money from his friends to build his campaign. Before the meeting, Trump told Bloomberg he was gathering together, quote, the biggest real estate people in the country, unquote. Also invited was Trump's longtime friend, billionaire Richard Lefrak, and the current and former chief executives of Vornado Realty Trust, Steve Roth and Michael Fascitelli. In all, there were more than 20 people who represented New York's movers and shakers. The lunch lasted about 2 hours. Witkoff said the general topic of conversation at the meeting was how to get the economy going again, but said, quote, I don't remember the details, unquote. He recalled that the threat of terrorism was also discussed, but that, quote, the larger discussion point just as much was the economy, and that's what people were talking about, unquote. And then it talks about the donations by Witkoff to the Trump Victory PAC and all of that. So this is very interesting, I think, because it shows that the epicenter of Trump's real estate networks that are very much tied into Russia and aspects of global organized crime, especially in this axis between Russia and Israel, but then again into parts of the West and into New York City, most especially, is at the heart of what was going on at that time. And by the way, this mention of people, the chief executives of Vornado Realty Trust, Steve Roth and Michael Fascitelli, we've talked about how Trump, has acknowledged there's this connection, of course, between Trump and Larry Silverstein, both being Manhattan real estate guys, but also in relationship to 9/11, where Trump is making calls to Larry Silverstein. Trump is observing 9/11 and having his assumptions about that. But Vornado Realty Steve Roth specifically, was also involved in making bids for the World Trade Center real estate in the run-up, in the months before September 11th, that was ultimately won by one Larry Silverstein, who Donald Trump recognizes as a great guy, of course.
Yes, and this is thank you for all that. This is laid out in a New York Observer article from April 9th, 2001, titled Silverstein Recovers Dark Horse May Win World Trade Center. And it goes into, I think, quite in depth into the bidding war between Larry Silverstein and Varnado and perhaps others as well, and even gets into a possible, what sounds like almost like a mafia-style possible hit operation against Larry Silverstein. So I don't know if that was the case or not, but this being hit by a car, run down by a car while he's crossing the street near Madison Avenue in New York City. So that's interesting. New York Observer article lays out in depth this, and also, of course, Louis Eisenberg, the head of the New York Port Authority, and his role on being on Trump's inaugural committee, as well as Michael Glassner, who we've discussed on numerous occasions, who was with the New York Port Authority, who went on to be the Southwest Regional Director for AIPAC and a significant part of Donald Trump's 2016 campaign, as well as his 2020 re-election campaign, it appears. And then Ronald Lauder as well was with the New York Port Authority, and we've discussed Lauder on numerous occasions. But this shows a couple of things to me. Number one is that Trump had, you hear about, like when you hear about, say, Zionist money going to Donald Trump, you hear about Sheldon Adelson, right? I believe Sheldon Adelson to the tune of $100 million in the last several months of the campaign. People will limit it at that. Well, Adelson had to give money to Trump or whatever. That's just one prominent, Jewish Zionist. Meanwhile, all of the the big Jewish money was going to Hillary Clinton, right? Goldman Sachs was going to punish or fire anyone that supported Trump. That was part of the narrative through the pro-Trump media. But in the process of this, we're seeing here with these names here, there's a lot of money coming into Donald Trump. from outside sources that goes far beyond just a Sheldon Adelson, and this is significant in the form that even the campaign money that was coming into Trump when Trump really started to need actual money outside of his own fortune when it was clear he was going to be receiving the Republican nomination and beyond, that he had his money come in from his real estate friends who just happened to be at the forefront of a lot of this New York City operation on September 11th, as well as in many ways at the epicenter or in the very prominently featured in this whole Russian-based, Soviet-based organized crime syndicate that's at the center of everything Donald Trump here. So, I mean, at this point, what this lays out to me is it's just really insulting. It's really infuriating that you have this narrative of Trump being the guy who's going to, somehow expose September 11th. It's very much been going through the InfoWar spear as well as I think through a lot of the QAnon movement as well. That Trump is going to expose all this stuff based on a couple of vague references to Saudi Arabia during the GOP primary, and then blaming Arab Muslims for what Israelis were doing on the September 11th. But I mean, it goes far beyond just even Larry Silverstein and Lou Eisenberg and Rudy Giuliani and people like that. I mean, it goes so far beyond. It almost seems that every rock you turn with Trump in this, the old saying, you turn, there's a, something pops up under every rock. It seems that under every rock you turn with Donald Trump and his long-term connections as well as his current connections, you'll find either connections to what was going on in New York on September 11th, connections to this international organized crime syndicate, the most hardcore proponents and propagandists of the most extreme elements of the Zionist movement, or you'll find a combination of all of it. And the epicenter for this, in so many ways, is the September 11th operation. That's why we look at not only Donald Trump as as the most, you might call him the most Zionist, most pro-Israel president in American history, but also the operation, the long-term and current operation of making Donald Trump president of the United States, from a propaganda perspective, from a financial perspective, and possibly from even a perspective related to compromise or compromat. You'll find under every single rock, you'll find connections to all of these, to all of this, and it's very infuriating to me that Donald Trump continues to be held up by some as a possible exposer of the very things that pretty much all of his associates have been involved with up to their necks in, and it's just very infuriating at this point. And if you got anything you want to add to that, I'll let you before we go on.
I just want to briefly run through this article, just a tiny bit. I don't want to read from it much, but I just want to make a few points and then read just a later paragraph in it, because this is a very interesting article that you were talking about what it actually means in some larger fashion in relationship to Donald Trump. Silverstein recovers. Dark horse may win World Trade Center by Andrew Rice, April 9th of 2001 in The Observer. And I'd never heard of this, that Larry Silverstein on January 25th, this is basically less than a week before he had a deadline to submit his bid to the trade center's current owner, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, was run down by a 1997 Ford sedan, his pelvis broken, and it was they call it a bad break at the worst possible time. He was one of three bidders. I mean, that's very interesting in the midst of that. And then later on, when as he's recovering, and he makes a blunt declaration in the New York Post, quote, "We're lusting after the World Trade Center, the prize of all prizes," unquote. And then it runs through how he was the dark horse of the Port Authority's three finalists. And of course, the three finalists are very interesting. This Vornado Realty is one of them. And basically all these guys seem to be like pretty close to Trump, all these bidders for it, and definitely all high-level Jewish Zionist billionaire power players.
And just to reiterate, Vornado is the aforementioned Stephen Roth. So
correct. And so then it talks about how Vornado had made a big, hundreds of millions offer beyond Silverstein's, and then so Silverstein ups his bid to just $30 million less, and then he waited for the negotiations to break down between the Port Authority and Vornado. And of course, in the background here, of course, is like the Kushners, right, and the Kushner father, Charles Kushner, and this whole sort of network surrounding this deal is very,
All
very
very close
telling.
to Netanyahu as well.
Yes, and we've pointed that out before that it's something about in the ashes, something about in the shadow of the ashes, or some story like that, where in the wake of September 11th, it points out that Larry Silverstein has had a long term relationship with Netanyahu where they talk every single Sunday on the phone. So this is not just some sort of like he's given him contributions or sometime like that. And so that's also what keeps popping up here, of course, is this is a Netanyahu operation. As I asked Michael Glassner when he was at the Dole Institute. And of course, in the background of the whole Dole story is also this question of lobbying on behalf of certain key Russian oligarchs like Oleg Deripaska and people like Haley Barbour of Mississippi and people like William Sessions, I think his name was, of the FBI, actually lobbying for some of these associated oligarchs and mafioso, including Sessions, the former FBI director, eventually lobbying on behalf of Mogilevich, it looked like. So that's in the background here, but that's when Glassner was there. I said, is this a Netanyahu operation? And I was asking him primarily in relationship to the question of Epstein and Trump, which we've dealt with enough before to let that be. But I'll link to a new video actually by Conscious Resistance that deals with this aspect of Epstein and whether Epstein is related to some type of Mossad operation that I think is very interesting. But then it talks about who was the third person. Back to the Observer article. Who is the third person here? I'm going to quote. Now it's Mr. Silverstein's turn, and this time the negotiations are going far more smoothly according to people following the process. When asked to comment on his bid, Mr. Silverstein said, quote, there is nothing comparable to the World Trade Center. It's unique in magnitude, location, prominence, and visibility. It has been my dream, unquote. As recently as late March, many predicted that Mr. Silverstein would be unable to close the deal and that the complex would go to the third place bidder, a partnership between Mortimer Zuckerman's Boston Properties and Brookfield Financial Properties. And it isn't. Is this is the same Zuckerman who's involved with the Zionist Organization of America?
I'm not sure if Mortimer Zuckerman's particularly involved with ZOA, but it does appear to me that Mortimer Zuckerman appears to almost be kind of the token anti-Trump real estate type of tycoon mogul involved in this whole scenario. He's the head of the New York Daily News and very, very partisan Zionist, but I'm not sure particularly about ZOA. But I mean, Mortimer Zuckerman's very influential in terms of the Zionist community in New York City, I'm sure. And it almost seems, as I said before, it almost seems like he's an outlier in that he opposes Trump and is in this whole circle here. So
okay, thank you for clarifying that. And then the last thing I want to deal with is this question of the legal aspects of this and who's in the middle of this deal. It talks about how Larry Silverstein is a very serious, tough negotiator, even though he uses things like charm offensives and to make his deals. But then it says that it quotes Louis Eisenberg and that everything's going well. And talks about sort of a shift from Vornado to Silverstein. But then it says, quote, Mr. Silverstein's allies attribute the relative comity to his years of friendly coexistence with the Port Authority, which is his landlord at 7 World Trade Center, an office building he developed in the late 1980s on Port Authority land. When the Twin Towers were bombed on Friday, February 26, 1993, former Port Authority Chief Financial Officer Barry Weintraub remembers Mr. Silverstein immediately offered free space in his building to the Port Authority staff. Quote, by Monday, the staff was back to work, unquote, he said. And there's one more paragraph, but before that, just remember what Building 7 is in relationship to it was eventually set up by people like Jerome Hauer of the Kroll managing director on September 11th in relationship to Giuliani, become the New York mayor's emergency management operations center, a very interesting building there that was then moved to Pier 92, where Tripod 2, a FEMA-based drill, had set up an entire operations center. It looks like up up, like right in the run up to September 11th, and then they were able to switch their operations center very, very quickly once again. Okay, last paragraph here. Quote, it can't hurt either that when Mr. Silverstein sits at the bargaining table, he sees some familiar faces on the other side. Ben Needell, for one. Mr. Needell, a lawyer at Skadden, Arps, Slate, Meager, and Flom, is one of the attorneys negotiating the deal for the Port Authority. Normally, he's Mr. Silverstein's lawyer. Quote, all I'll tell you is Larry's a great guy, unquote, Mr. Needell said. The reason I wanted to include that reference to Skadden Arps, as it's usually talked about, is that it's also, again, once again, at the center not only issues around 11/9 and the Mueller investigation, where a Skadden Arps lawyer called Van der Zwaan, who is the son-in-law of one of the key oligarchs who owns Alpha Bank or Alpha Group, I believe, Peter Aven, has been indicted in relationship to all of this, and it was very much in relationship to the Manafort operation in Ukraine. And then once again, back to 9/11, Skadden Arps is also it produces the lawyer who becomes the second paymaster, the paymaster to finish off the 9/11 payouts, one Sheila Birnbaum. So Skadden Arps I've also identified as at the epicenter of all U.S. Legal firms. It looks like to me, who has a high level, long-term relationship, a legal relationship to the corporate high-tech sector in Israel. So I would put it at the epicenter too of U.S. operations in relationship legally to the corporate aspect of the Talpiot program and the long-term Israeli military intelligence strategy to basically dominate the cyber sector. So, but even last thing here is that Skadden Arps is also at the epicenter of things like even further back to the 80s, where a lawyer there called Kenneth Bialkin, who's been at the head of basically any Jewish organized power organization you can think of, including the ADL and the B'nai B'rith International. He was at the epicenter of I believe, of the ADL at the time that the Jonathan Pollard spy scandal was hitting the fan, and apparently had made trips and was some type of conduit of communication in terms of attempting to do some damage control in relationship to all of that. So I think that's very, very interesting. So we have 2 minutes left here, Greg. Please close us out.
I guess thank you for all that important background information there, and I'm glad you were really able to dig into some of the important points in that New York Observer article. It sheds a lot of light, I think, regarding a lot of these connections and circles here as it relates to Trump's specific relationships with the very, very Zionistic, very mobbed up, you might say, New York real estate figures. I guess I'll close this with a preview of what I think we want to get into in depth next time, and that's a continuation of a conversation we had in July 2017, I believe, the fake war between Donald Trump and the media. And one of the articles we focused in on was an article that was published in the New York Times Magazine, April 4th, 2017. CNN had a problem. Donald Trump solved it inside the strange symbiosis between Jeff Zucker and the president he helped create. And this, I think, explains a lot as to the way the media, particularly CNN, covers the Trump any type of collusion narrative or any type of serious inquiry into Trump's background in a very limited manner. So we're going to get back on that topic on our next show. And I'd like to close by briefly describing an article that you brought to my attention, Jeremy, from Politico. December 6, 2017, ABC reprimands producer for giving data to Trump campaign. Chris Vlasto gave Trump advisor David Bossie proprietary exit polling on election night. In this article, it gets into how Vlasto gave the Trump campaign via David Bossie, deputy campaign manager, these exit polls that were not to be given out prior to a specific time, I believe 5 o'clock in the evening, and gave it to the Trump campaign, and in turn Bossie gave it to Steve Bannon and Jared Kushner. And
20
the
seconds.
Significance of this is that I just want to say there are Chris Vlasto types all over the media, not just in this position at ABC News. We're going to get more into this on our next show. And so this is food for thought, just wondering exactly what, if anything, was done with this exit data. And we will talk more about this on our next show. We'll get more into depth on this in this bigger topic of Donald Trump and the media.
Thank you so much for breaking that down, Greg. And until next time, Antidote, we out.
Later.